Hey guys, welcome to the 4th episode of my Axial SCX10 build series. The axles, suspension links, and shocks have been assembled in previous episodes, and in this episode, I will go over steps 18 to 26 of the SCX10 Raw Builders Kit. For steps 18 to 26, you will need Bag D, Bag E, parts from Plastic Bag 2, parts from Plastic Bag 3, a motor, some grease, some thread lock, a hex wrench, and a nut wrench. To start step 18, dab some thread lock on the 3 small screws. Then, screw each of the 3 screws into the outdrive shafts. After that, you can install one bearing on each side of the outdrive shaft. Step 19 assembles the transmission gears. First, slide a bearing, an idler gear, and another bearing onto the shorter steel shaft. Put that aside, and on the longer steel shaft, slide on a bearing and a drive gear. Then, insert a pin into the shaft and slide another bearing onto the shaft. Make sure the pin goes into the groove on the drive gear. For step 20, coat the idler gear in a thick coat of grease and slide it into the transmission housing. Then, coat the outdrive gear in grease and install it in the transmission. Lastly, coat the input gear in grease and slide it into the transmission. Now you can close the transmission housing with 4 screws. When doing so, make sure to screw slowly so the screw holes don't overheat from friction, as it is very tight. You may need to screw in some, back the screw out, and screw in again if it's super tight. Step 21 assembles the slipper clutch. First, slide one slipper plate onto the slipper shaft of the transmission. Then, peel the adhesive backing on one slipper pad and stick it to one side of the spur gear. Do the same to the other side of the spur gear and slide it onto the slipper shaft. You can then proceed to add a plastic ring that goes in the center of the spur gear, another slipper plate, and a clutch spring. After that, screw on a hex nut until the spring is compressed to be 8 mm long. On step 22, we can mount the motor onto the transmission. First, dab some thread lock onto the pinion grub screw, screw it into the pinion, and slide it onto the motor shaft. Since the flat spot on my motor does not go to the base of the motor shaft, I will have to install it in the opposite position the manual states. Then, loosely screw in the motor screws and set the gear mesh. We can now install the motor cover, but since my pinion sticks out too much, I will have to skip this step. That completes the transmission, and we can now move on to the drive shafts. Step 23 assembles the front drive shaft. First, dab some thread lock onto the screw and secure the ball joint to the drive shaft. We can then slide the joint pin into the ball, push it to the other half of the joint, secure it with a pin, and slide the plastic cover over it. I also like to add a bit of shock oil to lubricate the joints. Now you can do the same thing to the other side of the drive shaft and slide them on both ends of the spline. For step 24, you will need to choose your own wheelbase before assembling the rear drive shafts. If you chose the 12.3 or 12.0 inch wheelbase, use the 45mm long driveshaft bodies. If you chose the 11.4-inch wheelbase, use the 33mm long driveshaft bodies. The rear driveshafts have essentially the same assembly process as the front. We can now continue on to step 25. For step 25, we can install the front and rear driveshafts, each with one grub screw. And lastly, for step 26, we can bolt on the bottom skid plate with 4 screws onto the bottom of the transmission. That completes episode 4 of the Axial SCX10 build series. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, hit the like button, consider subscribing, and if you have any questions or comments, drop them in the comments section down below. Like always, I'll see you guys in the next one.